In a quiet suburban middle school in Lincoln Heights, a soft-spoken substitute teacher was about to face down a pack of teenage bullies. What started as a routine hallway monitoring duty took a shocking turn when they came face to face with the ringleader dragging her toward the floor by her collar. Commander Elise Warren wasn't your typical fill-in educator. For 12 grueling years, she had served in the U.S. Navy SEALs, known for her unshakable calm under pressure and close quarters combat skills. When she encountered a snarling student lunging to trip another kid, she had no idea she was walking into a planned humiliation. Warren's instinctive takedown left jaws dropped and phones recording, an act that would lead to media firestorms, internal investigations, and a seismic shift in school culture. What began as a temporary teaching assignment would become a reckoning. The halls of Lincoln Heights would never be the same after one woman turned the bullies game against them and taught an entire community the meaning of controlled power. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The October rain hammered against the reinforced windows of Jefferson High like automatic weapons fire, and Eve Dawson stood in the doorway of room 237 watching 30 pairs of teenage eyes evaluate her with the cold calculation of predators sizing up what they assumed was easy prey. She was 38 years old, with prematurely gray streaks threading through her dark brown hair that was pulled back in a severe military bun, and a jagged scar that ran from her left jawline down to her collarbone. Disappearing beneath the collar of her conservative navy blue blouse, the scar caught the flickering fluorescent light, like a lightning bolt frozen in flesh, and several students stared at it with the morbid fascination teenagers reserve for car accidents and violent video games. But Eve was used to being stared at, and she had learned long ago that scars told stories to those who knew how to read them. Jefferson High looked exactly like what it was, a fortress built to contain rather than educate, with its chain-link fences with razor wire security cameras mounted at every corner and metal detectors that greeted students each morning like prison checkpoints. The building itself was a monument to institutional failure. 3 stories of crumbling brick and broken dreams, where hope went to die and futures were decided by zip codes rather than potential. The hallways smelled like industrial disinfectant layered over decades of teenage sweat, cafeteria grease, and something that might have been despair, while the classrooms looked like bunkers with their reinforced windows, barred doors, and motivational posters that hung askew like bandages on mortal wounds. Principal Sheila Torres had given Eve the standard warning during their brief meeting in an office that smelled like stale coffee and crushed aspirations. Listen, Ms. Dawson, I appreciate you taking this assignment on such short notice, especially considering what happened to your predecessors. But I need you to understand exactly what you're walking into. Room 237 is where we put our problem children, the seniors who have already driven away 3 certified teachers. This semester alone, Mrs. Henderson lasted 6 weeks before requesting a transfer to elementary school. Mr. Franklin quit after 2 weeks, and Ms. Walsh walked out mid-lesson on day 4 and never came back. These kids don't respect authority. They don't respond to traditional discipline, and they certainly don't care about graduating. My advice is simple: keep your head down, stick to the textbook, and don't try to save anyone, because the only person you need to worry about saving is yourself. Eve had nodded politely and said nothing because there was nothing to say that wouldn't reveal too much about why she was really here. Principal Torres saw another desperate substitute teacher grateful for any employment. Eve saw a mission objective and the chance to finally put her skills to use in a way that might honor her sister's memory, even if nobody else would ever understand the real reason she had traded her Navy SEAL trident for a teaching certificate and a stack of books about adolescent psychology. As she set her worn leather messenger bag down on the scarred wooden desk that looked like it had survived multiple wars, Eve's eyes swept the classroom with the same systematic precision she had once used to identify enemy positions in hostile territory. She noted the exits, 2 doors and 3 windows, the sight lines, clear angles of fire from multiple positions, and most importantly, the established power structure that governed this particular ecosystem like an apex predator's territory. In the back left corner near the windows that looked out onto the school's cracked parking lot sat the 3 boys who clearly ruled this domain, and Eve could identify them as the primary threats without needing to observe their behavior patterns just from the way every other student in the room unconsciously oriented themselves in relation to their positions like planets orbiting. A dangerous son, Tyrell Morgan, was obviously the pack leader, tall and athletically built, with the kind of casual confidence that radiated from someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. His dark skin was unmarked by the scars that came from actual street violence, and his expensive clothes, designer sneakers that probably cost more than most teachers, made in a week, and gold jewelry that caught the light marked him as someone who had never known real poverty or genuine fear. His posture was relaxed but predatory, like a big cat that knew it owned whatever territory it chose to claim. Liz Alvarez sat to his right, shorter and stockier, with intelligent brown eyes that held a calculating gleam, suggesting he served as the strategist for whatever psychological warfare campaigns they waged against substitute teachers. His loyalty to Tyrell was obvious in the way he watched his leader's face for subtle cues, and his role as the tactical planner was evident in how he studied Eve with the focused attention of someone mapping out weaknesses and pressure points for future exploitation. The third member of their trinity was Caleb Stroud, a hulking presence who filled his desk like a linebacker crammed into an airplane seat. His blonde hair was buzzed military short, and his pale blue eyes held the kind of empty coldness that suggested violence was never far from the surface. His massive hands bore scars across the knuckles, and he radiated the particular stillness that came from growing up in a household where any sudden movement might trigger an explosion. His role as enforcer was written in every line of his intimidating frame. Well, Tyrell announced loudly enough for the entire classroom to hear, his voice carrying the theatrical projection of someone performing for an audience rather than engaging in actual conversation. Looks like the district sent us another substitute teacher. What do you think, gentlemen? Does she look old enough to have her driver's license, or did they recruit her straight from the local middle school? The comment triggered nervous laughter from approximately half the class, while the other half looked away, uncomfortably unwilling to join in, but equally unwilling to defend someone who would probably be gone within days. Nobody wanted to make themselves a target by standing up for a substitute teacher who clearly didn't understand what kind of environment she had walked into. Eve felt 30 pairs of eyes turned toward her, waiting to see how she would react to this opening salvo. This was the crucial moment that had broken her 3 predecessors when they either tried to assert authority too aggressively or showed weakness by ignoring obvious disrespect. But Eve had learned patience in places where the wrong reaction could get people killed, and she had no intention of playing their game by their established rules. Instead of responding to Tyrell's provocation, Eve simply turned to the whiteboard and began writing in neat block letters that betrayed her military training. Today's objective: character development through dialogue, how authors reveal truth through subtext. Her handwriting was precise and economical, without flourishes or artistic embellishments, and her movements were controlled and deliberate as she turned back to face the class. Good morning, I'm Eve Dawson, and for the foreseeable future will be exploring how writers use character voice to reveal psychological depth and emotional complexity. Her voice was calm and steady, without the nervous tremor that had marked her predecessors, and she made brief eye contact with each student, including the 3 predators in the back corner, who were clearly expecting her to either cower or overreact to their intimidation tactics. As Eve spoke, she noticed a small dark-haired girl in the 3rd row who was sketching with quick, precise strokes in the margins of her notebook. The girl's name, according to the seating chart, was Marisol Vega, and something about her withdrawn energy and careful attention to detail suggested she was more observant than most of her classmates. The sketch appeared to be a portrait but from her angle Eve couldn't make out the subject. "Miss Dawson," Louise called out with exaggerated politeness that fooled absolutely nobody. "I'm curious about your qualifications to teach us about revealing psychological depth. I mean, you look pretty young to have much life experience, and that's an interesting scar you've got there. Did you get that from another teaching job, or is there a more exciting story behind it?" The question was clearly designed to either embarrass Eve or provoke her into revealing personal information that could be used against her later. But Eve had been interrogated by professionals who made teenage bullies look like amateur hour, and she wasn't about to be rattled by someone who thought psychological warfare was asking rude questions in front of an audience. "Scars do tell stories, Mr. Alvarez," Eve replied evenly, her gray eyes meeting his brown ones without flinching. "Some people wear their damage on the outside, where everyone can see it, while others hide their wounds beneath carefully constructed facades. But eventually the truth has a way of revealing itself, and that's precisely what we'll be studying in great literature. Difference between what characters show the world and what they're actually feeling underneath." The response seemed to catch Louis off guard, because he had clearly been expecting either defensiveness or an attempt to change the subject instead. Eve had acknowledged his attack, redirected it into the lesson plan, and delivered what amounted to a subtle psychological counterstrike, all without missing a beat or showing any sign of discomfort. Caleb shifted in his seat with a deliberate scraping sound that drew everyone's attention and fixed Eve with the kind of stare that had intimidated countless teachers and students over the years. His pale blue eyes were flat and predatory like a shark, evaluating potential prey, and his massive frame radiated barely contained violence as he let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for everyone present. But Eve had stared down Taliban fighters and cartel enforcers in places where backing down meant death, so one angry teenager with impulse control issues wasn't going to make her break eye contact or show weakness. Instead, she looked back at him with the same calm assessment she might give a potentially dangerous but ultimately manageable threat, and after several long seconds, Caleb was the one who looked away first, though the muscle jumping in his jaw suggested he wasn't pleased about it. Marisol glanced up from her artwork with sudden interest, and Eve caught a glimpse of what she had been drawing, a figure that looked remarkably like Eve herself, but surrounded by flames and rising from what appeared to be ashes or battlefield debris. It was an image that suggested the artistic student had picked up on something about their new teacher that the three predators had completely missed. The rest of the period passed without major incident, though Eve could practically hear the wheels turning as Terrell, Louise, and Caleb whispered among themselves, clearly planning their next escalation. They had expected to break another substitute teacher on day one, and her complete lack of reaction to their opening gambits had obviously frustrated their carefully rehearsed intimidation routine. When the bell rang, Eve positioned herself near the door and made eye contact with each student as they filed out, noting who met her gaze and who looked away, who seemed eager to escape and who lingered hoping for more entertainment. Terrell made sure to bump into her desk as he passed, causing her lesson plan folder to slide toward the edge, but Eve caught it with reflexes that were too quick and controlled for a normal civilian teacher. "See you tomorrow, Miss Dawson," Tyrell said with a smile that never reached his eyes. "I'm really looking forward to learning more about hidden truths and psychological complexity. I have a feeling this class is going to be very educational for everyone involved, especially you." As the last student disappeared into the hallway, Eve allowed herself a small smile that would have looked completely out of place on any normal teacher's face. It was the expression of someone who had just accepted a challenge from opponents who had no idea what kind of game they were actually playing or how many moves ahead. She was already thinking. The next 3 weeks at Jefferson High unfolded with the brutal predictability of psychological warfare as Tyrell, Louise, and Caleb escalated their campaign against Eve with the methodical precision of teenagers who had perfected the art of destroying substitute teachers over years of practice. They arrived exactly 7 minutes late every single day, disrupting whatever lesson she had. Begun with elaborate fabricated excuses delivered with the kind of theatrical sincerity that made it impossible to call them out, without seeming petty and vindictive to the 30 other students who served as their captive audience. "Sorry, we're late, Miss Dawson," Terrell would announce with exaggerated concern, as he sauntered through the door followed by his loyal lieutenants. But there was a situation in the hallway where someone dropped their lunch tray and we had to help clean it up because we believe in being good citizens and contributing to our school community. I hope we didn't miss anything too important in your fascinating lesson about Shakespeare. The transparent lies were delivered with such mock earnestness that Eve couldn't challenge them without appearing unreasonable, while the rest of the class snickered at her obvious frustration as she was forced to restart whatever explanation she had been giving about character development or dramatic irony. It was a simple but effective tactic designed to establish their dominance while making her look incompetent to any administrator who might happen to walk by during one of these performances. They would accidentally knock her carefully organized materials off the desk while walking past, sending lesson plans and handouts scattering across the floor like autumn leaves, while forcing Eve to scramble to collect them in front of 30 teenagers with cell phone cameras ready to capture her humiliation for later entertainment. They would bump into her desk when she turned to write on the whiteboard, causing her coffee mug to spill across her grade book and forcing her to spend precious class time cleaning up the mess while they offered insincere apologies that fooled absolutely nobody. The psychological pressure was relentless and professionally calculated as they questioned every assignment, challenged every instruction, and responded to every attempt at discipline with the kind of legalistic wordplay that suggested they had studied the student handbook more thoroughly than most teachers knew the curriculum. Miss Dawson, according to Section 12 of the Student Rights Policy, we're entitled to express our opinions about classroom activities, and I personally feel that Shakespeare is culturally irrelevant to our lived experiences as modern teenagers. Shouldn't we be studying authors who reflect our contemporary diversity? Eve watched these performances with the detached professionalism of someone who had been trained to analyze enemy tactics for weaknesses and exploitable patterns. These boys were skilled at what they did, but their psychological warfare was still amateur hour compared to what she had faced in actual combat zones where the consequences of miscalculation were measured in blood rather than bruised egos. What they didn't understand was that Eve was conducting her own intelligence gathering operation using her access to school databases, security camera footage, and careful observation to build detailed psychological profiles of each primary target. Tyrell Morgan lived with his alcoholic uncle in a house where violence was as common as breakfast, and his carefully constructed image as confident leader masked deep insecurities about his own powerlessness in situations he couldn't control. Luis Alvarez walked his younger sister to school every morning because their neighborhood was dangerous, and his older brother was serving time for armed robbery, making him fiercely protective of the few people he actually cared about. Caleb Stroud came from an ultra-religious household where emotional expression was considered weakness and physical dominance was the only acceptable way to assert masculinity. This information was ammunition Eve was carefully stockpiling for the moment when she decided to go on the offensive, but for now she needed to let them think they were winning while she positioned herself exactly where she needed to be for maximum psychological impact when the time came to demonstrate exactly what they had walked into when they decided to target her. Breaking point came on a gray Tuesday morning in November when Terrell decided to escalate beyond psychological games into physical intimidation designed to humiliate Eve in front of the entire class while creating viral content for social media distribution. He had recruited additional soldiers for this operation, including Marcus Webb, a nervous junior who existed solely to laugh at his jokes, and David Kim, whose expensive camera equipment marked him as the designated documentarian for whatever cruelty they had planned. Miss Dawson, Tyrell announced with the kind of theatrical concern that immediately put everyone on high alert. "I've been thinking about your lessons on dramatic irony, and I think we need a practical demonstration of how it works in real-life situations, where people don't realize they're about to learn something important about themselves." The comment sent ripples of anticipation through the classroom as students pulled out their phones and positioned themselves for optimal viewing angles, while Eve continued writing on the whiteboard with the same calm precision that had marked every previous day. She had been expecting this escalation based on her analysis of their behavioral patterns, and she was prepared for whatever crude theater they had rehearsed. "Today we're going to learn about gravity and balance," Louise added helpfully as he moved closer to the front of the room, "specifically how people can lose their footing when they least expect it, especially when they're so focused on appearing strong and in control that they forget to watch where they're stepping." Eve noted their positions with peripheral vision, while continuing to write about character motivation and the gap between public persona and private reality. These boys thought they were staging an ambush, but what they were actually doing was walking into a carefully prepared demonstration of why underestimating your opponent was the fastest way to discover exactly how outclassed you really were. The attack came with choreographed precision as Caleb moved to block the exit, while Weiss positioned himself between Eve and her desk, creating a human wall that would prevent any escape or call for help. Meanwhile, Tyrell approached from behind with the confidence of someone who had never faced real resistance to his carefully planned humiliations. "Oops, sorry, Miss Dawson," Caleb said with mock sincerity as he deliberately bumped into her, causing her to stumble slightly. "I guess I'm just naturally clumsy around people who think they're better than everyone else. Maybe you should watch where you're standing." Before Eve could respond, Louise was grabbing a small area rug that had been positioned near the whiteboard, yanking it out from under her feet with enough force to send her crashing to the floor in front of 30 students with cameras rolling and social media accounts ready to broadcast her humiliation to the entire school within minutes. Something unexpected happened in the split second between losing her balance and hitting the ground. Eve's training kicked in, and she controlled her fall with the practiced grace of someone who had spent years learning how to land safely under enemy fire. Her body rolled with the impact, distributing the force across muscle groups designed to absorb punishment, and she came to rest in a position that looked vulnerable but was actually tactically advantageous. The classroom erupted in laughter and phone cameras as students recorded what they assumed was their teacher's complete humiliation and professional destruction. But Eve lay perfectly still on the floor for several long seconds, looking up at Tyrell, Louise, and Caleb with an expression that made all three boys suddenly uncomfortable, though they couldn't quite articulate why. There was something in her gray eyes that hadn't been there before, a coldness that suggested they had just crossed a line they didn't even know existed and awakened something that had been sleeping beneath the surface of their mild-mannered substitute teacher. It was the look of someone who had just stopped pretending to be helpless and started calculating exactly how much damage she could inflict before anyone could stop her. "Well, that was educational," Eve said quietly as she rose to her feet with movements that were too controlled and precise for someone who had just taken an unexpected fall. "I think we've all learned something important about assumptions and consequences today." Class dismissed. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The words were delivered with such calm authority that 30 teenagers found themselves gathering their belongings and filing out of the room without question or protest, while Tyrell, Louise, and Caleb stood frozen in place, wondering why their moment of triumph felt more like the calm before a very dangerous storm. The video spread through Jefferson High like wildfire across drought-stricken grassland. Within 2 hours of the incident, every student in the school had watched their substitute teacher crash to the floor while 3 senior boys laughed and pointed cameras at her humiliation. It was uploaded to Instagram, TikTok, and Snapchat with captions like "Teacher gets owned" and "Miss Dawson takes a fall," and "By lunch period, It had been shared beyond the school boundaries into the wider social media ecosystem, where suburban teenagers could mock an adult's professional destruction. From the safety of their own privileged bubbles, Eve sat in her empty classroom during the lunch break, watching the footage play on repeat on her laptop screen with the same clinical detachment she had once used to analyze enemy tactics after failed operations. The video showed her falling harder than she had actually experienced, hitting the floor with what appeared to be bone. Jarring impact while 30 teenagers erupted in cruel laughter, and 3 boys stood over her like conquering heroes, claiming territory that had never actually belonged to them. Principal Torres knocked on her door at exactly 12:45 with the kind of sympathetic expression administrators reserve for teachers who were about to become liability problems. "Ms. Dawson, I heard about the incident this morning, and I wanted to check on you personally to make sure you weren't injured and to discuss how we should handle this situation moving forward." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in institutional cowardice disguised as administrative concern. Principal Torres explained that while the boys' behavior was clearly inappropriate, there were complex factors to consider, including the fact that Tyrell was being recruited by college basketball scouts. Louise came from a troubled home environment, and Caleb's parents were major donors to the school's athletic programs. Any disciplinary action would need to be carefully calibrated to avoid lawsuits, negative publicity, or disruption to the basketball team's championship prospects. "I understand this is frustrating, Ms. Dawson, but these boys come from complicated backgrounds, and we have to think about the bigger picture here," Principal Torres said with the kind of patronizing sympathy that made Eve's jaw clench almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps it would be best if you took the rest of the week off to recover from this traumatic experience, and when you come back we can discuss strategies for classroom management that might help you avoid future confrontations." Eve listened to this bureaucratic doublespeak with growing clarity about exactly why Jefferson High had become a breeding ground for teenage sociopaths who faced no meaningful consequences for their actions. The administration was more concerned with protecting their own careers than creating an environment where learning could actually occur, and teachers were viewed as expendable resources rather than professionals deserving basic respect and physical safety. "I appreciate your concern, Principal Torres, but I'll be back tomorrow morning as scheduled," Eve replied with the kind of calm professionalism that suggested she was much less traumatized than expected. "I believe there are still important lessons to be taught, and I intend to see this assignment through to completion, regardless of any challenges that might arise." That evening in her sparse apartment that looked more like military quarters than civilian housing, Eve sat at her kitchen table with a locked metal box that contained items she hadn't touched since leaving active duty. Her Navy SEAL identification card, commendation letters from successful hostage rescue operations, and a single photograph of her younger sister, Jeremiah, taken just months before the bullying at her high school had driven her to take her own life. Jeremiah had been 16 years old when she died, just 2 years younger than the boys who had humiliated Eve in front of 30 witnesses today, and the parallels between past and present were too obvious to ignore. Teenage predators using psychological warfare to destroy someone they perceived as weak, adults failing to provide protection or justice, and a system that prioritized reputation over human dignity had joined the Navy SEALs partially to honor her sister's memory by becoming someone who could protect the innocent from those who would abuse them. But her military service had taken her to foreign battlefields where the enemies were armed with weapons rather than smartphones, and cruelty was honest rather than disguised as entertainment. She had saved hostages from terrorists and cartels, but she had never been in position to save the one person who mattered most. Transition from soldier to teacher had been her attempt to fight the same battle on a different battlefield, using education instead of ammunition to wage war against the kind of institutional indifference that had killed Jeremiah. But watching that video on repeat made it clear that some enemies only understood force, and some lessons could only be taught through demonstration rather than explanation as she held her seal, identification card between fingers that bore scars from a dozen different combat zones. Eve made a decision that would change everything for 30 teenagers who thought they understood how power worked. She was done pretending to be helpless and allowing 3 teenage sociopaths to terrorize a classroom full of potential victims, and done playing by rules that protected predators while sacrificing their prey. Tomorrow morning, she would begin teaching Tyrell, Luis, and Caleb lessons. They would never forget about the difference between genuine strength and the illusion of control. They thought they possessed lessons about consequences and accountability, and the reality that some people only looked vulnerable until you pushed them far enough to stop pretending. The photograph of Jeremiah smiled up at her from the table, and for the first time since her sister's death, Eve smiled back with an expression that would have terrified anyone who understood what it meant when someone with her training stopped playing defense and decided to go on the attack. Class was about to begin, and the real education was just getting started. Eve arrived at Jefferson High the next morning 45 minutes before first period, carrying herself with the precise movements of someone who had spent the night planning a military operation rather than grading papers. Her appearance was identical to every previous day: conservative blouse, hair in a severe bun, lesson plans organized with military efficiency. But something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. She was no longer playing defense. The school security system was laughably inadequate by military standards. Eve had spent her evening researching the building's layout, camera positions, and blind spots using publicly available architectural plans and her own observations. Jefferson High had been built in 1987, with a security upgrade in 2018 that focused more on keeping weapons out than monitoring what happened inside. The hallway cameras had significant gaps in coverage, and the classroom monitoring was virtually non-existent. As students began filtering into room 237, Eve activated a small digital recorder concealed in her lesson plan folder. Every conversation, every threat, every moment of psychological warfare would now be documented with the kind of precision that could stand up in court or administrative hearings. She had learned in combat zones that intelligence was worthless unless it was actionable, and she intended to build an airtight case against her 3 primary targets. Tyrell arrived first, strutting through the door with the swagger of someone who believed yesterday's humiliation had established his dominance permanently. His expensive basketball shoes squeaked against the linoleum as he took his seat in the back corner, pulling out his phone to show Louise and Caleb the view counts on their viral video. 4,000 shares already, he announced loudly enough for Eve to hear. Looks like Miss Dawson is famous now. Eve continued writing on the whiteboard without acknowledgement, but her peripheral vision tracked every movement as Louise and Caleb joined their leader. Louise looked slightly uncomfortable, glancing toward Eve with what might have been the beginning of guilt, while Caleb cracked his knuckles in anticipation of whatever escalation they had planned for today's entertainment. Today we'll be discussing the concept of dramatic irony, Othello, Eve announced as she turned to face the class. Specifically, how Iago manipulates others by exploiting their weaknesses and blind spots. It's fascinating how someone can appear powerless while systematically destroying their enemies from within. The lesson choice was deliberate. Eve had spent years studying psychological operations, and she understood that the most effective attacks were often invisible until it was too late to defend against them. As she explained how Iago gathered intelligence on his targets, she watched Tyrell's face for any sign that he understood the parallel being drawn. "Miss Dawson," Tyrell interrupted, with mock concern, "are you feeling okay today? You seem different somehow. Almost like yesterday's little accident changed something about you. I hope you're not planning to do anything ... dramatic." The comment was delivered with enough ambiguity to maintain plausible deniability while clearly being a threat. Eve smiled pleasantly and continued her lesson. "That's an excellent observation, Mr. Morgan. Sometimes a single event can serve as a catalyst for transformation. Iago's entire campaign began with a perceived slight, but his response was patient and methodical rather than impulsive. During lunch period, Eve accessed the school's student information system, using credentials she had obtained through methods that would remain classified. Tyrell Morgan's file revealed a pattern of disciplinary issues dating back to middle school, including 3 incidents of physical intimidation against younger students. His academic performance was marginal despite his athletic abilities, and his college recruitment was entirely dependent on basketball scholarships that could be revoked for behavioral violations. Alvarez's records showed a more complex picture. His grades were above average, suggesting genuine intelligence, but his association with Tyrell had led to increasingly serious infractions. Most telling was a guidance counselor's note from freshman year, mentioning his fear that his older brother's incarceration had made him a target for recruitment by local gangs. His loyalty to Tyrell appeared to be protective rather than genuinely malicious. Caleb Stroud's file was the most disturbing. Multiple teachers had noted his concerning behavior, including an incident where he had cornered a female student in an empty hallway until she agreed to do his homework. His parents had threatened legal action against any teacher who tried to discipline him, and the administration had clearly decided he was too dangerous to confront directly. That afternoon, Eve positioned herself in the school parking lot where she could observe the boys' after-school interactions. Through high-powered binoculars that were standard equipment for reconnaissance operations, she watched Tyrell's uncle pick him up in a battered pickup truck. Even from a distance, she could see the man's aggressive body language as he berated Tyrell for something, punctuating his words with sharp gestures that made the teenager flinch. Lees walked home alone, taking a circuitous route through neighborhoods that showed increasing signs of urban decay. He stopped at an elementary school to collect a young girl who shared his facial features, presumably the sister mentioned in his file, and Eve noted how his entire demeanor softened as he helped her with her backpack and held her hand while crossing busy streets. Caleb was collected by a woman in an expensive SUV whose license plate led Eve to a sprawling house in one of Detroit's wealthier suburbs. Through social media research, she identified the woman as his mother, a prominent member of several conservative religious organizations who regularly posted about traditional family values and biblical discipline. Each piece of intelligence was another weapon in Eve's growing arsenal. These boys had built their reign of terror on the assumption that their victims were powerless and their actions had no consequences. They were about to discover how wrong they were on both counts. The school-wide pep rally was scheduled for Friday afternoon, a mandatory celebration of Jefferson High's basketball team that would pack the entire student body into the gymnasium. For an hour of manufactured school spirit, Eve had been observing these events for weeks, noting how they served as platforms for the social hierarchy to reinforce itself through public displays of dominance and submission. Tyrell would be center stage as the team's star player, basking in adulation while his loyal followers documented every moment for social media distribution. It was the perfect environment for what Eve had planned, a demonstration that even kings could fall when they least expected it. The gymnasium's audio-visual system was controlled from a booth overlooking the bleachers, accessible through a maintenance corridor that most staff members had forgotten existed. Eve had spent several evenings exploring the school's infrastructure, mapping every entrance and emergency exit with the thoroughness of someone planning an extraction operation. At exactly 2:30 p.m., as Principal Torres began her opening remarks about school pride and academic excellence, Eve was 30 feet above the crowd in a utility space that provided access to the projection equipment. Her laptop was connected to the system through a cable she had acquired from the school's technology department using her substitute teacher credentials. The presentation began normally with highlight reels of basketball victories and testimonials. from college recruiters about Tyrell's promising future. The crowd cheered on cue while the three boys preened in their positions of honor on the stage below, clearly enjoying their moment of absolute social dominance. Then the video changed. What appeared on the massive screens throughout the gymnasium was security footage that Eve had obtained through her nocturnal reconnaissance missions. It showed Tyrell cornering a freshman student near the lockers, demanding lunch money with the casual cruelty of someone who had never faced consequences for his actions. The audio was crystal clear as he threatened the smaller boy with violence if he reported the incident. The crowd's cheers died into uncomfortable silence as they watched their basketball hero revealed as nothing more than a common bully preying on younger students. But Eve wasn't finished. The next clip showed Louise and Caleb participating in a coordinated harassment campaign against a female student, following her through hallways while making crude comments about her appearance. Tyrell's face went white as he realized what was happening. He looked desperately toward the projection booth, but Eve was invisible in her elevated position. His carefully constructed image was crumbling in real time in front of 800 witnesses, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The final video was the most damaging. It showed all three boys planning their attack on Eve, discussing in detail how they would humiliate her and upload the footage for maximum viral impact. Their words revealed them as calculating predators rather than mischievous teenagers, and the crowd's mood shifted from confusion to genuine anger. Principal Torres frantically signaled the technology staff to cut the projection, but Eve had anticipated this response. Her program was designed to complete its cycle regardless of external interference, and the final slide displayed a simple message: bullies only look powerful until someone shines a light on them. The rally ended in chaos as students pulled out their phones to record Tyrell's public humiliation while teachers struggled to maintain order. Eve slipped out of the building through a maintenance exit, leaving no trace of her presence except for the devastation she had inflicted on three boys who had believed themselves untouchable. Monday morning arrived gray and bitter, with the kind of cold that seemed to seep through the school's ancient heating system and settle into everyone's bones like a prediction of winter's cruelty. Eve entered room 237 to find the atmosphere charged with a different kind of tension than she had experienced in previous weeks. The pep rally incident had shifted the social dynamics in ways that were still playing out. Through whispered conversations and nervous glances, Tyrell's entrance was theatrical in its fury. He slammed through the door 15 minutes late, flanked by Louise and Caleb, with an expression that promised violence to anyone who dared meet his eyes. The confident swagger that had marked his previous performances was replaced by the coiled aggression of someone whose carefully constructed image had been shattered in front of the entire school. "Miss Dawson," he announced with barely controlled rage, "I think it's time we had a serious discussion about respect and consequences. Some people seem to think they can embarrass their betters without facing any repercussions for their actions." The threat was no longer disguised behind theatrical politeness or plausible deniability. Eve noted that several students were already recording with their phones, anticipating violence that would provide fresh content for their social media feeds. But she also observed something else. Marisol Vega had positioned herself with a clear view of the entire classroom, her sketchpad open, and her artistic eye capturing details that others missed. "I'm always interested in discussions about consequences, Mr. Morgan," Eve replied calmly as she continued organizing her lesson materials. "Perhaps we could explore how actions create ripple effects that often surprise the people who initiate them." Louise moved to block the classroom door while Caleb positioned himself between Eve and her desk, creating a human barrier that would prevent escape or calls for help. The coordination was more sophisticated than their previous attacks, suggesting they had spent considerable time planning this escalation. "You think you're clever, don't you?" Tyrell continued, moving closer to the front of the classroom, hiding behind technology and manipulation instead of facing us directly. But we know it was you at the rally, and now you're going to learn what happens to teachers who don't know their place. The classroom fell silent except for the soft clicks of phone cameras and the barely audible sound of Marisol's pencil scratching across paper. Eve remained perfectly still, her gray eyes tracking the movements of all three boys while calculating distances, angles, and potential responses to whatever violence they were preparing to unleash. "This time we're not going to be gentle, Liz," added, his voice carrying a hardness that suggested he had fully committed to whatever they had planned. "This time you're going to understand exactly who runs this school and what happens to people who try to challenge us." What happened next unfolded with brutal efficiency. Caleb grabbed Eve's arm while we seized her other wrist, and together they dragged her away from the whiteboard toward the center of the room, where their audience would have an unobstructed view of her humiliation. But instead of resisting or crying out, Eve allowed herself to be moved while maintaining the kind of controlled breathing that kept her heart rate steady and her mind clear. "Oops, sorry, Miss Dawson," Tyrell said with vicious mockery as he positioned his foot to trip her. "I guess you're about to take another fall, but this time it's going to hurt a lot more than last time." They shoved her toward the floor with enough force to cause genuine injury, expecting to see her crash helplessly while 30 students recorded her destruction for later entertainment. But Eve had spent 12 years learning how to fall safely, under enemy fire, and her body responded with trained muscle memory that transformed their attack into a controlled landing. More importantly, something shifted in her expression as she looked up at the three boys standing over her. The mask of mild-mannered substitute teacher finally slipped completely, revealing the predator that had been hiding underneath. Her gray eyes held the kind of coldness that Tyrell had never seen before, the look of someone who had stopped pretending to be helpless and started calculating exactly how much damage she could inflict. "Interesting," Eve said quietly as she rose to her feet with movements that were too precise and controlled for someone who had just been violently attacked. "I think we've all learned something important today about assumptions and miscalculations." The words were delivered with such calm authority that 30 teenagers found themselves holding their breath, sensing that they had just witnessed something significant without fully understanding what it meant. Even Tyrell looked uncertain as he realized that his moment of triumph felt more like the beginning of something dangerous than the end of his problems. The transformation began the next morning with surgical precision. Eve arrived at school carrying herself with the same controlled movements as always, but her campaign against the three boys shifted from reconnaissance to active psychological warfare. She had spent the night analyzing the intelligence she had gathered, identifying pressure points and vulnerabilities that could be exploited without leaving fingerprints. Tyrell's first indication that something had changed came during second period when he was called to the guidance office for an emergency meeting with his college recruiter. The University of Michigan coach, who had been courting him for months, sat across from a conference table, covered with printouts from social media accounts that documented every instance of bullying, harassment, and intimidation that Eve had carefully compiled over the previous weeks. "Son, I'm going to be direct with you," the coach said with the tired expression of someone who had dealt with too many talented athletes who couldn't control their behavior. "These videos and testimonials paint a picture of someone who might be a liability to our program. College basketball is about more than just putting points on the board. We need young men who represent our university with character and integrity." The meeting lasted 30 minutes and ended with the coach's promise to reassess Tyrell's recruitment status pending a thorough investigation into the allegations. Tyrell left the office with the sick realization that his entire future might have just evaporated because of evidence he hadn't even known existed. Least discovered his own consequences during lunch when his younger sister Carmen burst into tears upon seeing him in the cafeteria. Through her sobbing, she managed to explain that someone had shown her classmates the video footage of her brother participating in the harassment of female students. The 8-year-old couldn't understand why Her hero was being cruel to other people, and her disappointment cut deeper than any official punishment could have. "I told my friends you were good," Carmen whispered as Luis tried to comfort her. "I told them you protected me and made me feel safe. But now they say you're mean to other kids, and I don't know what to believe anymore." The conversation took place in full view of the cafeteria, and Luis felt the weight of hundreds of eyes watching him try to explain to a heartbroken child why he had betrayed everything she believed about his character. For the first time since joining Tarail's group, he questioned whether loyalty to his friend was worth destroying his sister's faith in him. Caleb's reckoning came during his 6th period study hall when he exploded at a freshman student who accidentally bumped into his desk. The verbal assault was so vicious and disproportionate that even his usual enablers looked uncomfortable, and when Ms. Patterson attempted to intervene, Caleb's rage expanded to include threats against faculty members. "You want to discipline me?" he screamed, his face flushed red with fury that had been building for weeks. "My parents donate more money to this school than your pathetic salary covers in 5 years. I can get you fired with one phone call, so maybe you should mind your own business before you find out what real consequences look like." The outburst was recorded by multiple students and uploaded to social media within minutes, where it joined the growing collection of evidence that painted Jefferson High's former Hall Kings as unstable bullies rather than charismatic leaders. Principal Torres had no choice but to suspend Caleb pending a formal investigation, effectively removing him from the social hierarchy he had spent years climbing. Eve observed these developments with the satisfaction of someone watching the carefully planned operation unfold exactly as designed. She had never directly confronted any of the boys or made explicit threats, but her methodical documentation and strategic release of information had created a cascade of consequences that was destroying their power base from multiple directions. Simultaneously, during her final class of the day, she noticed Marisol approaching her desk with the careful movements of someone who had been gathering courage for weeks. The artistic student placed a folded piece of paper next to Eve's lesson plans and whispered, "I know who you really are. My sister showed me pictures from before she died. She said Jeremiah talked about you all the time." The note contained a single sentence written in careful script. "Thank you for finally fighting back. Some of us have been waiting a long time for someone to stand up to them." Eve looked up to find Marisol's dark eyes shining with something that might have been hope. And for the first time since arriving at Jefferson High, she allowed herself to smile with genuine warmth rather than strategic calculation. The mission was far from over, but she was no longer fighting alone. As the final bell rang and students filed out of room 237, Eve remained at her desk organizing materials for the next day's lessons. Tyrell, Lise, and Caleb had been neutralized as immediate threats, but the real work was just beginning. She had proven that bullies could be defeated, but now she needed to teach 30 teenagers how to build something better from the wreckage of their former social order. The lesson plan for tomorrow would focus on redemption and the possibility that even damaged people could choose to become better versions of themselves. It was a concept she hoped at least 3 particular students would be ready to explore. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Jefferson High's empty parking lot as Eve walked toward her car at exactly 3:47 p.m., carrying her leather messenger bag with the same measured pace she had maintained throughout her weeks at the school. She appeared completely absorbed in reviewing her lesson plans, but her peripheral vision tracked every movement in the surrounding area with the hyper-awareness of someone who had survived too many combat zones to ever truly relax her guard. Tyrell's ambush was predictably amateur in its execution. He had recruited 2 older boys from the neighborhood, Marcus Webb's brother Damon, and a dropout named Trevor who still hung around school grounds, looking for opportunities to prove his relevance. They positioned themselves behind a maintenance shed where they believed they could corner Eve without witnesses. clearly expecting her to panic or beg when confronted with superior numbers and physical intimidation. "Miss Dawson," Tyrell called out as he stepped into her path, flanked by his reinforcements. "I think it's time we settled this situation once and for all. You've caused me a lot of problems over the past few weeks, and now you're going to learn what happens to people who don't know when to back down." The threat was delivered with the kind of theatrical menace that suggested Tyrell had been rehearsing this confrontation in his mind for days, imagining how satisfying it would feel to finally break the teacher who had destroyed his carefully constructed image. But what he saw in Eve's gray eyes wasn't fear or surprise. It was the calm assessment of a predator who had been expecting this exact scenario. "Mr. Morgan," Eve replied quietly, setting her bag down with deliberate precision. "I appreciate you finally deciding to be direct about your intentions. It makes what happens next much simpler for everyone involved." Damon moved first, probably expecting to overwhelm their target with his size advantage and street fighting experience. At 19 years old and nearly 6 feet tall, he had been in enough brawls to consider himself dangerous, but he had never faced someone with Eve's training. His wild haymaker punch never connected because Eve wasn't where he expected her to be when his fist arrived. The combat unfolded with brutal efficiency that would have impressed her former SEAL instructors. Eve's movements were economical and precise, using Damon's momentum against him as she stepped inside. His guard and applied pressure to nerve points that dropped him to his knees with a strangled gasp. Trevor's attempt to grab her from behind ended when she drove her elbow into his solar plexus with just enough force to empty his lungs without causing permanent damage. Tyrell watched his backup crumble within 15 seconds and suddenly understood that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation about the woman he had been tormenting for weeks. This wasn't a helpless substitute teacher. This was someone who moved with the lethal grace of a trained killer, and the cold intelligence in her eyes suggested she was just getting started. "Your turn," Eve said conversationally as she turned, her full attention to the boy who had orchestrated months of psychological warfare. "Unless she'd prefer to discuss this situation like civilized adults instead of resorting to violence." Tyrell's response was to charge forward with all the desperate fury of someone whose entire worldview was collapsing around him. But Eve had been expecting this reaction, and her counter was perfectly timed. She sidestepped his wild attack and used a joint lock that sent him face first into the asphalt with minimal effort on her part. "The mistake you made," Eve said quietly, as she knelt beside Tyrell while maintaining the painful hold on his arm, "was thinking that pain makes people afraid. But some of us learned a long time ago that pain is just information, and fear is just another tactical consideration." She released the lock and stood up, leaving Tyrell gasping on the ground while his two accomplices struggled to catch their breath. None of them had been seriously injured, but all three had received a demonstration in the difference between perceived power and actual capability. "You have two choices now," Eve continued, pulling out her phone to show them footage she had recorded of the entire encounter. "You can continue down this path and discover exactly how much trouble someone with my background can create for teenage boys who think violence is the answer to their problems. Or you can start making better decisions about how you treat other people." From her concealed position near the school building, Marisol captured the entire confrontation with her phone camera, but her artistic eye saw something that others might have missed. In the moment when Eve stood over her defeated attackers, there was no satisfaction or cruelty in her expression, only the tired professionalism of someone who had done what was necessary to protect herself and potentially others. The following Monday morning found Tyrell sitting alone in room 237 20 minutes before first period, slumped in his usual seat in the back corner, but stripped of the arrogant confidence that had once made him the undisputed king of Jefferson High's social hierarchy. His recruitment meeting with the University of Michigan had been officially canceled. His social media accounts were flooded with criticism from classmates, who had finally found the courage to speak out against his behavior. And his uncle had delivered the kind of beating that left bruises in places that wouldn't show. Eve entered the classroom to find him waiting with the hollow-eyed expression of someone whose entire identity had been systematically dismantled over the course of 2 weeks. She set her bag down on the desk and regarded him with the same calm assessment she might have given a former enemy who had requested a truce meeting. "Mr. Morgan," she said quietly, "I wasn't expecting to see you here so early. Most people in your situation would be avoiding me rather than seeking me out." Tyrrell looked up with eyes that held none of their former malice, replaced instead by a vulnerability that made him appear younger than his 18 years. "I need to know who you really are," he said with the exhausted honesty of someone who had run out of strategies and pretenses. "I need to understand how someone like you ended up in a place like this." Eve studied his face for several long moments, searching for signs of deception or manipulation, but found only genuine curiosity mixed with the kind of desperate confusion that came from having one's entire worldview shattered. She made a decision that went against every instinct developed during 12 years of military service. "My name is Eve Dawson, and I served as a Navy SEAL for 12 years before becoming a teacher," she said, settling into the chair behind her desk. "I came to Jefferson High because my younger sister Jeremiah died by suicide when she was 16 years old, and the bullying she experienced at her school was a major contributing factor to her decision." The revelation hit Tyrrell like a physical blow. He had been expecting some kind of elaborate backstory involving witness protection or undercover law enforcement, not a simple statement about family tragedy that explained everything about Eve's presence at their school. "She was 2 years younger than you are now," Eve continued, her voice maintaining its professional calm despite the emotional weight of the subject. "Intelligent, artistic, and kind to everyone she met. But a group of boys at her school decided she was an easy target, and they made her life hell for months while the adults who were supposed to protect her looked the other way." Tyrrell felt something crack inside his chest as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. This woman hadn't been targeting him randomly. She had been fighting a war that began with her sister's death, and he had volunteered to be her enemy by choosing to become exactly the kind of person who had destroyed her family. "I joined the military to learn how to protect people who couldn't protect themselves," Eve explained. "I spent years fighting terrorists and criminals in foreign countries, but I never had the chance to save the one person who mattered most. So I became a teacher, specifically seeking placement in schools where bullying was a serious problem." The classroom fell silent, except for the sound of Tyrrell's ragged breathing as he struggled to process emotions he had spent years suppressing. For the first time since childhood, tears began forming in his eyes as he confronted the reality of what he had become and the pain he had inflicted on countless innocent people. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and the words seemed to tear something loose inside him. "I'm so sorry about your sister. I'm sorry about everything I've done to you and to other people. I don't know how to be different than this." Eve reached into her desk drawer and withdrew a manila folder containing documents that Tyrrell couldn't see from his position. "The footage from our encounter in the parking lot could destroy what's left of your future," she said quietly. "I could ensure that every college recruiter in the country sees evidence of you attempting to assault a teacher. Your uncle's drinking problem and history of domestic violence could become public knowledge that follows you for the rest of your life." Tyrrell's face went white as he realized the scope of power this woman held over his destiny. She had been gathering intelligence on every aspect of his life while he had been focused on petty psychological games, and now she possessed the ability to destroy him completely with a few strategic revelations. "But I'm not going to do any of those things," Eve continued, "because destruction was never my objective. My sister's death taught me that revenge doesn't heal anything. It just creates more pain that spreads to innocent people who never deserved to be hurt." She slid a different set of papers across the desk toward him. These are applications for community service programs that work with at-risk youth in Detroit. There's also information about anger management counseling and academic tutoring that could help you salvage your college prospects through academic rather than athletic achievement. Tyrell stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. Why would you help me after everything I've done? Because my sister would have wanted me to, Eve replied simply. She believed that people could change if someone gave them a reason to try. I'm offering you the chance to become someone she would have been proud to know, instead of someone who represents everything that destroyed her. The bell rang, signaling the beginning of first period, and other students began filtering into the classroom. But for Tyrell Morgan, the real education was just beginning. 6 weeks later, Jefferson High felt like a different school entirely. The hallways that had once echoed with the casual cruelty of teenage hierarchies now hummed with something that resembled actual learning, and the cafeteria no longer resembled a war zone where social status was determined by one's ability to humiliate others. The change hadn't happened overnight, but it had been profound enough that even the most cynical teachers began to believe that institutional transformation was actually possible. Tyrell Morgan walked through those same hallways with a purpose that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known him during his reign as Jefferson High's unofficial king. He wore a simple t-shirt for the community center where he now volunteered 3 afternoons a week, working with middle school students who reminded him uncomfortably of his younger self. The expensive designer clothes and gold jewelry had been replaced by modest practical items that reflected his new priorities. "Hey Marcus," he called out to a freshman who was being hassled by 2 upperclassmen near the lockers. "Is there a problem here?" The confrontation dissolved immediately as the older boys recognized Tyrell's voice and understood that the former bully had somehow transformed into someone who protected rather than preyed upon the vulnerable. It was a conversion that had shocked the entire school, but one that had inspired other students to reconsider their own behavior patterns. Luis Alvarez had thrown himself into academic achievement with the same intensity he had once devoted to psychological warfare, maintaining a 4.0 GPA while running a peer tutoring program that helped struggling students avoid the kind of academic failure that had once made them targets for harassment. His relationship with his sister Carmen had been restored through months of patient effort to prove that he had genuinely changed, and she now bragged to her classmates about her brother's transformation. Caleb Stroud had been the most difficult to reach, requiring intensive therapy and anger management counseling before he could begin to address the deep-seated issues that had driven his violent behavior. His return to school had been gradual and carefully monitored, but he now served as a powerful example that even the most damaged individuals could choose to become better versions of themselves. In room 237, Eve conducted her final lesson of the semester with a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with test scores or academic standards. She had taught 30 teenagers something far more valuable than literary analysis. She had shown them that power could be used to protect rather than destroy, and that genuine strength came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. "Miss Dawson," Marisol said after the other students had left, approaching the desk with a carefully wrapped package. "I wanted to give you something before winter break." Inside the wrapping was a bound collection of artistic sketches that told the story of Eve's time at Jefferson High, from her arrival as an underestimated substitute teacher through her systematic dismantling of the school's bullying culture. The final image showed students of all backgrounds working together in a classroom where learning had replaced fear as the dominant emotion. "I'm calling it the Fire Watcher," Marisol explained. "My sister always said that someone needed to stand guard against the darkness, and that's what you did for all of us." That afternoon, Eve found herself standing in front of a granite headstone in a quiet cemetery outside Detroit, holding a small metal object that had defined her identity for more than a decade. Her Navy SEAL trident had been with her through deployments in Afghanistan, Iraq, and a dozen other places where she had fought to protect innocent people from those who would harm them. I finally figured out how to use everything you taught me, Jeremiah, she said quietly, placing the trident on the grave marker. Not with weapons or violence, but by becoming the kind of teacher who could have saved you if I had been there when you needed me. Principal Torres had offered her a permanent position at Jefferson High, along with funding to develop a comprehensive anti-bullying program that could be implemented throughout the district. Eve had accepted both offers, understanding that her real mission was just beginning. There were other schools, other students who needed someone to stand between them and the predators who fed on their vulnerability. The drive back to Jefferson High took her through neighborhoods that had once seemed like war zones, but now felt like communities where hope was beginning to take root. The building itself looked different in the afternoon light, less like a prison and more like a place where young people could discover their potential rather than surrender to their circumstances. In her apartment that evening, Eve sat at her kitchen table reviewing applications for the youth trauma program she was developing. SHIELD would provide counseling, mentorship, and academic support for teenagers who had experienced bullying, abuse, or other forms of violence. It would be staffed by volunteers who understood that healing required more than just stopping the immediate threat. It required building something better from the wreckage. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Tyrell. "Thank you for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Carmen's school is having problems with bullying, and they asked me to come speak to the students. I told them I knew someone better qualified if you're interested." Eve smiled as she typed her response. "Send me the details." That's exactly the kind of mission I've been training for my entire life. Outside her window, the lights of Detroit stretched toward the horizon like stars scattered across a battlefield. There were other schools out there, other students who needed someone to stand guard against the darkness. Eve Dawson had finally found her true calling, and she was just getting started. The war against bullying would be won one classroom at a time, one student at a time, one transformed heart at a time. And somewhere in the distance, she could almost hear her sister's voice whispering that the fight had been worth it. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.